By the end of the summer of 1963, civil rights groups have organized a massive nonviolent movement. Their actions had, in large part, turned the attention of the nation and of President Kennedy to fighting racial injustice in the United States.
Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free.
Kennedy's approach to the civil rights had evolved since his first days in office. Having narrowly won the 1960 election, he was at first cautious and reluctant to alienate powerful Southern leaders who supported segregation. During his first 2 years in office, he took what was seen by many civil rights supporters as limited action. He issued executive orders banning discrimination in federal hiring and federal housing, and he established the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. In addition, the Justice Department, under Attorney General Robert Kennedy, actively promoted school integration, obtained an Interstate Commerce Commission ruling, and enforced desegregation on interstate travel, and launched 5 times the number of lawsuits resulting from voting violations than the previous administration. However, after witnessing large-scale demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama in May 1963 and the violent backlash from segregationists, Kennedy became convinced that racial injustice was no longer tolerable. In a landmark speech on civil rights on June 11, 1963, he called racial inequality a moral issue and announced his plan to submit legislation to help end racial discrimination. On June 19th, the president submitted civil rights legislation to protect all Americans' voting rights, legal standing, educational opportunities, and access to public facilities. Passing this legislation became the focus of Kennedy's approach to addressing civil rights issues. In Birmingham, there was hope for progress, too. In May 1963, after weeks of massive demonstrations, arrests, and violent police response, Black leaders met with a group of white business leaders who recognized the economic impact of the boycotts and demonstrations and the decline of Birmingham's national reputation. They agreed to desegregate lunch counters and hire Black clerks in department stores. Also, just prior to the demonstrations, Birmingham citizens elected a new government structure and new mayor, Albert Boutwell, who proclaimed his support for a more moderate approach, and he had made promises to change the unfair customs of the city. However, the election results have been contested, and die-hard segregationists and still had power in the city. By the end of the summer, basic demands that had been agreed upon had yet to be fulfilled. In the week following the August 28th March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Birmingham made headlines as a segregation stronghold once again on September 3rd, as Governor George Wallace attempted to close schools and block desegregation. On the following day, a bomb exploded, which was the second in 2 weeks, at the home of Albert Shores, who was a Black lawyer who had been fighting for the desegregation of Birmingham schools. Riots erupted in the city following the bombing, and Wallace persuaded the mayor to close the schools. The brutality of the police response crushed hopes for progress. When the schools reopened on September 9th, Wallace commanded the National Guard to block the entry of African American students. President Kennedy seized control of the Guard through an executive order and commanded the soldiers to leave. Over the next week, protests for and against integration sprang up around Birmingham. On September 15th, an event occurred that changed the history of the city and the history of the civil rights struggle. On September 15th, yet another bomb exploded, but this time at the 16th Street Baptist Church, a spiritual center for the Black community in the very place where young demonstrators had prepared for marches that spring. It was yet another attack on Black residents by the KKK members. The city had already earned the name Bombingham after 47 explosions had taken place since 1947, none of which had been solved. But this one was different. 4 young girls were killed: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Birmingham to calm the shattered Black communities. But young and old were enraged, and police responded brutality to citizens.
That morning, when Denise asked Addie to tie the sash on her dress, and when she reached her hand out to tie it, that's when the bomb went off, and the debris came in, and I was blinded from the debris. I called her name, but she didn't answer, so I thought the girls had ran back on the Sunday school side of the church, but I found later on that I was the only survivor.
The horrific tragedy drew national attention, with a third of the messages sent to the White House calling for federal troops to be sent to Birmingham. But President Kennedy was reluctant to send troops and decided on a different course of action. The day after the bombing, he released a public statement in which he expressed a deep sense of outrage and grief over the killing of the children in the bombing. In the statement, he announced that Assistant Attorney General Burke Marshall had returned to Birmingham to be an assistant of the community leaders and law enforcement officials. He also directed Federal Bureau of Investigation bomb specialists to lend every assistance in the detection of those responsible for the crime. At the request of Martin Luther King Jr., he met with King and several black leaders from Birmingham on September 19, 1963, to hear and respond to their needs. They expressed a deep sense of frustration and fear rampant in the black communities, facing bombings, killings, and other acts of police brutality. They insisted that federal intervention was essential. They pressed the president to send in federal troops, cancel federal contracts with businesses that practiced racial discrimination. They feared that if the federal government did not take steps to restore hope and protection for blacks in Birmingham, the civil disorder would escalate into race riots. That same day, he announced that he was sending a committee of two, the Royal Black Mansion, General Kenneth Royal, who had served as Truman's Secretary of War, and Colonel Orr Blake, a retired football coach at West Point, to represent me personally and help the city to work as a unit in overcoming the fears and suspicions which now exist.
And we're in church that Sunday in September, and all of a sudden, the pastor gets a note
At the pulpit.
at the pulpit. He stops preaching and tells us that that other church, our sister church, where relatives and of sons and daughters and fathers and mothers have been bombed, and didn't know how bad it was. It was just a shock. And he said, please don't rush out. But it was the first time we'd ever seen church stop.
My parents, as the events were unfolding on television, why do they hate us so much? And I remember my father simply saying, they're hateful men. They're just hateful men. It was terrifying for a child of 8.